few months ago, I was having dinner with a former policy advisor in a quiet corner of Brussels. This is a man who spent 30 years building the European dream, someone who usually speaks in the sanitized language of data points and optimistic acronyms. But that night, he seemed different, distracted. He kept looking out the window at the bustling square outside, where the ancient stone buildings were lit up like a museum exhibit. I asked him what he thought about the latest defense integration reports. He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned in and whispered a phrase I'd never heard from a man of his stature. Civilizational erasure. He wasn't angry or even sad. He sounded like a doctor giving a diagnosis he knew the patient wouldn't accept. He told me that when he looks at the city now, he doesn't see a sovereign capital. He sees a high-end shopping mall where the security guards have been told to stop checking IDs. He said the most terrifying thing isn't the threat at the gates, but the fact that we've systematically dismantled our own immune system. What struck me wasn't just the term, but his tone. A cold, observational detachment. This was a noble betrayal. Here was one of the architects of the modern West calmly explaining why the structure was designed to fail. He'd spent his life creating a union meant to safeguard Europe, yet here he was, describing its entropic slide as if it were an inevitable law of physics. It left me wondering, if the people in charge have already accepted the twilight, what does the 2025 national security strategy actually know that we don't? Why is our collective memory being treated like a liability instead of an asset? And what happened to a civilization when its own guardians become the architects of its disappearance? This isn't just a policy shift, it's a strategic warning that the borders of the West have moved from the map into the mind.
That phrase, civilizational erasure, is perfect. Well, it's chilling. Especially coming from someone on the inside, it's probably the most precise diagnosis I've ever heard.
It sets the stage perfectly for what we need to get into today.
It really does, because he's talking about the systematic dissolution of everything that holds a society together.
Yeah.
You know, things like demographic continuity, the authority of the state, and maybe the most important one, cultural confidence.
And the idea that it's a noble betrayal, that the system was almost designed to fail.
Exactly. It suggests the institutions that were meant to protect the West, like the EU or NATO, have somehow just given up on the basic duty of self-preservation. That's the entropic slide he mentioned.
So our mission for this deep dive is to look at those internal causes.
Yeah.
What did you call them? The internal solvents.
Right. The institutional, the sociological, the ideological shifts that have piece by piece dismantled the civilization's immune system, the things that turn a capital city into that shopping mall with no real allegiance, no purpose.
Okay, let's start with that structural failure. It feels like the heart of the institutional problem is this collapse of objective standards. And that road seems to begin with something we all think we believe in: meritocracy.
It does. The popular idea of meritocracy is, on the surface, incredibly appealing. You know, the best and brightest rise to the top based on their own talent and effort.
It's the foundation of the whole dream, really. But what we're looking at here suggests the myth is a world away from how it actually functions.
Worlds apart. And to really get this, you have to go back to where the term even came from. It was coined in 1958 by a sociologist, Michael Dunlop Young. And here's the kicker. He meant it as a pejorative.
A pejorative. So he wasn't championing it.
Not at all. He was writing a satire, a work of fiction called The Rise of the Meritocracy, where he described a complete dystopia.
A dystopia. How so?
His warning was that if a society ever truly succeeded in rewarding only the meritorious, which he defined really narrowly as just IQ plus effort, those people at the top would eventually harden into a new, untouchable social class.
A new aristocracy.
Precisely. They'd intermarry, they'd pass on all their advantages, and, crucially, they would come to believe that their success was entirely their own doing, that they deserved it all. And that leaves no room and absolutely no sympathy for anyone left behind.
And that dystopian prediction is basically what's happened. The myth has been co-opted.
It's been perfectly co-opted by the existing elites. It no longer functions to create opportunity. It functions to justify the hierarchies we already have, economic, social, political. It's become a machine for the dynastic transmission of wealth and privilege.
If you believe the game is fair, then you have no right to complain if you lose.
Exactly. The burden of failure shifts completely onto the individual.
And this is where Michael Sandel's work, The Tyranny of Merit, comes in. He argues this isn't just a quiet problem in the background. It actively creates anger and resentment.
It has to, because it reframes your exclusion as a personal moral failure. You didn't make it. Well, you must not have worked hard enough. You just didn't measure up. It's not just an economic injury. It's an insult.
It's shame.
It's public shame. The system completely ignores the structural realities, unequal access to good schools, to capital, to the right networks, and instead it tells the working and middle classes that their struggles are their own fault, and that's a powerful way to maintain control.
Let's put some numbers to this, because the contrast between the myth and the reality is pretty staggering, especially in the US, which really sees itself as the home of meritocracy.
The numbers are stark. For all the talk about the American dream, class mobility in the US is actually among the lowest in the developed world.
How low are we talking?
We're talking about a situation where roughly 50% of a father's income position is inherited by his son. 50%.
Wow. And how does that compare to other countries?
Well, you look at a place like Norway or Canada, and that number is less than 20%. If you're born into the poorest fifth of the population in the US, you have about an 8% chance of making it to the top fifth. In Denmark, that number is almost double. The system is just much, much stickier than the myth allows.
So why do people continue to believe in it so strongly if the evidence is so clear? Is it just hope?
It's more than hope. It's a kind of psychological defense. The belief that the system is fair is essential for people to maintain loyalty to it. It's that old line about the American working class seeing themselves like temporarily embarrassed millionaires.
Right. The idea that my big break is just around the corner, so I should defend the system that will one day reward me.
Exactly. Even if that religion is actively holding you, and most people like you, back.
And this myth then bleeds into all sorts of other areas, like discussions about race and inequality.
Oh, absolutely. The myth is used to promote a kind of colorblind philosophy that can be, well, weaponized. If you see deep racial disparities in university admissions or in corporate boardrooms, the meritocratic explanation is that it must be due to individual shortcomings.
Not systemic issues.
Never systemic issues. It's always a supposed lack of effort or cultural preparation. This belief is then used to dismiss the very idea of institutional racism and becomes the main argument against any kind of remedial policy like affirmative action. It's a closed loop that constantly justifies itself.
Okay, so we have this rigid system that's designed to reproduce the elite class, all hidden behind this powerful cultural myth. What happens when that elite class starts to grow too big for the system? This brings us to elite overproduction.
Right. This is where Peter Turchin's work is so insightful. He's a proponent of what's called cliodynamics, basically applying mathematical models to history.
Studying historical cycles.
Exactly. And he argues that complex societies are held together by this invisible web of mutual trust. When that trust breaks down, you start to see these destabilizing trends develop over decades. And he points to the late 1970s as a key turning point.
What happened then?
We saw this huge surge in productivity, but wages for the average worker just stagnated. That creates a massive gap, and it's a perfect recipe for social discontent and eventually slower growth for everyone.
And this is the environment where you get what's called the glut of aspirants. Too many people expecting a seat at the top table.
That's the core of it. Elite overproduction happens when your society starts churning out way more highly educated, highly ambitious people than there are elite positions for them to fill.
So more law degrees, more PhDs, more MBAs.
Exactly. But the number of positions for, say, Supreme Court justices or senators or Fortune 500 CEOs, that number stays relatively fixed. So what you might have called the top 1% in 1970 in terms of credentials and ambition is maybe 3 or 4% today. And they're all fighting for the same handful of spots.
That sounds like a pressure cooker. The people who lose out in that competition aren't just going to be happy to go manage a department store.
They will absolutely not. Historically, the result is almost always social discord, sometimes violence. Turchin's models show this pattern again and again, whether it's the late Roman Republic or Imperial China or even pre-revolutionary France.
Really? It's that consistent?
It's a remarkably consistent pattern. A large surplus of angry, credentialed, and blocked elite aspirants is one of the most destabilizing forces a society can face. They become a huge political problem. The state tries to find jobs for them, which leads to overspending, bureaucracy, bankruptcy, and sometimes collapse.
So to put it plainly, the real long-term threat isn't necessarily poverty at the bottom, but this huge pool of ambitious, educated people who feel like the system cheated them out of the elite status they were promised.
That is the chilling conclusion. The system ends up producing its own would-be executioners. They're smart, they're politically savvy, and they feel deeply betrayed. They don't just disappear, they become the leaders of radical movements. They turn all that ambition against the very system that created them.
That's a profound shift in how we think about political instability.
Okay, that really covers the structural decay. But the immune system isn't just structural, it's cultural, it's psychological. We need to move into what you've termed the de-civilizing turn.
Right. And to get what that means, we first have to understand what the civilizing process was in the first place. The sociologist Norbert Elias wrote about this. For him, civilization wasn't just about art or technology. It was a long, slow psychological process.
A change in how people behaved.
And how they felt. It was about developing self-control, restraining impulses, and internalizing a set of shared social norms. And a huge driver of this was the avoidance of shame. People developed manners and decorum because they valued being part of the social group and didn't want to be embarrassed or cast out.
And the argument we're examining today is that this entire process is now running in reverse.
Fundamentally, yes. The sources argue that late-stage consumer culture has kicked off a de-civilizing turn. The highest values are no longer social cohesion and restraint, but things like self-worth and radical individual agency. The result is a spike in narcissistic tendencies and, maybe most destructively, a rising threshold for shame.
What does a rising shame threshold actually look like in practice?
It means that behaviors that would have once been seen as disqualifying things that would have caused deep public embarrassment and forced someone to retreat are now just seen as maybe a little awkward. Or worse, they're celebrated as some kind of brave act of speaking your truth.
So when the guardrails of shame disappear, so does thick behavior.
The guardrails are gone. Citizens begin to see only their democratic rights, not their responsibilities. Public engagement becomes about asserting a personal truth, validating a lifestyle, not about finding common ground.
It sounds like a regression.
It is. It's a regression to a more capricious, impulsive state. Before that civilizing process really took hold, powerful people acted on a whim. There was very little restraint. And if we lose that internal restraint, political life becomes erratic and consensus becomes impossible because there's no social cost for bad behavior.
Let's drill down on the psychology here, this idea of narcissism as a cultural phenomenon, not just a personal flaw.
That's a key distinction. We're talking about a social condition defined by self-centeredness, a grandiose sense of self, and a habit of using other people for your own gratification. It's fundamentally antisocial. It corrodes the bonds of family and community that a civilization needs to continue.
And this connects to the idea of the saturated self.
Yeah.
What does that mean for how people see their own identity?
The saturated self is this postmodern idea that identity isn't a fixed, rooted thing anymore. It's more like an assemblage of different roles you play. You're constantly making yourself up on the spot, changing your identity to fit your social media profile or your current social circle.
And the only thing that makes it real is that you claim it as my story.
Exactly. My truth. And this creates this desperate need for external validation and a deep, deep fear of not getting it. Your own self-validity becomes the highest possible standard, and it completely pushes aside any need for objective, societal standards of truth.
Which is where the digital world becomes the perfect engine for this.
It's the fuel on the fire. Your self-importance gets validated at 247 by likes, by shares, by the algorithm feeding you what you want to hear. It creates this little psychological bubble where expert opinion or objective facts don't really matter. Why should I listen to an economist when 10,000 people on the internet agree with my gut feeling?
We saw that play out in a huge way during the Brexit campaign with the open dismissal of expert views.
That was a watershed moment. When a senior politician like Michael Gove said the country has had enough of experts, he was tapping directly into that narcissistic retreat. He was saying, your common sense, your gut feeling is more valid than verifiable knowledge. Expertise gets reframed as an elite conspiracy designed to invalidate your personal truth.
And when that personal truth is challenged, the response is rage.
Instant rage. Because the narcissistic ego is incredibly fragile. When your personal reality is threatened, even by facts, rage is the defense mechanism. It allows you to feel morally righteous in your anger, and it completely shuts down any possibility of reflection, empathy, or learning something new. It hollows out the very idea of a shared public square.
So this cultural shift then becomes institutionalized. This leads us to the therapeutic state.
This is where it all comes together. The structural decay and the psychological decay merge into a new way of governing. The term therapeutic state comes from a psychiatrist named Thomas Szasz back in 1963. He was a huge critic of his own profession.
And what was his definition?
He defined it as the collaboration between psychiatry and the government. His argument was that psychiatry was essentially a pseudoscience that had become a kind of secular state religion for managing people who don't conform.
We hear a lot of complaints about the nanny state. How is the therapeutic state different? and, you argue, more dangerous.
The difference is crucial. The old nanny state told you what to do. Wear your seatbelt, pay your taxes. It operated on your behavior. The therapeutic state tells you what to think and feel.
It operates on your mind.
Right. And Saz argued this makes it far more authoritarian. It replaces moral judgment with a medical diagnosis. So if you're unhappy or you dissent politically, you're not wrong or immoral. You're sick. You have a condition that needs to be cured or managed by the state's experts.
What did that do to the traditional idea of citizenship, the one based on duty and sacrifice?
It completely displaces it. The government's main job is no longer to be an impartial arbiter of law. Its job is to be a dispenser of psychological validation. It encourages everyone to adopt a victimhood identity because that's how you make claims on the state.
So grievance becomes a form of currency.
The primary form.
Yeah.
And this cultivates a kind of defensive narcissism across the whole society where the highest possible good isn't achieving something great, but simply avoiding microaggressions, avoiding any kind of discomfort.
And the final result of all this is a civilization that can't defend itself.
It leads directly to institutional disarmament. This whole ethos of safetyism, this obsession with emotional safety above all else, makes our core institutions, well, weak. Universities, the media, corporations. Their main goal becomes avoiding offense. They start to fear a difficult debate more than they fear an actual external threat. And when your elites reach that point, they've already surrendered. The internal solvent has done its job.
That is a terrifying diagnosis. Let's pivot now and use a real-world example as a kind of litmus test for all this decay. Let's talk about Israel. The way the West relates to Israel seems to be a mirror for its own will to survive.
It's probably the most charged and revealing litmus test we have. You hold up Europe's condition, the demographic issues, the erosion of the nation-state, this general feeling of defensive enervation, and you contrast it with Israel's model of, robust demographic vitality and fierce commitment to its own sovereignty. The difference in civilizational will is just profound.
Before we get to Israel, let's just clarify the European side of the equation, this paradox of sovereignty.
The paradox is that the project of ever closer union in Europe was intentionally designed to erode the power of the classic nation-state. Sovereignty in its traditional sense was watered down and delegated upwards to a bureaucracy.
So you give up control over your currency, your borders, your final legal authority.
And your allegiance becomes purely transactional. It's a matter of economic convenience, not existential purpose. The state becomes that shopping mall. And when you lack that core instinct for self-preservation, Israel's very different attitude becomes a really stark contrast.
But Israel has its own deep internal threats, even with its strong external posture. What's the main internal danger that's being analyzed?
The central threat, according to many Israeli security analysts, isn't the loss of its Jewish character, but the potential loss of its democratic identity. The danger comes from a series of moves to erode the foundations of its democracy, and it's all centered on controlling the judiciary.
Right, the political attacks on the Supreme Court and this proposal for an override clause.
The override clause is the key. We really need to understand what this would do.
Okay, break it down for us. What are the mechanics?
The proposal would allow the Knesset, the parliament, to simply repass a law that the Supreme Court had already struck down as unconstitutional. And the threshold to do this would be a simple majority, basically the ruling coalition itself.
So the same people who passed the law in the first place could just ignore the court's decision.
Precisely. It would effectively eliminate the independence of the judiciary. The courts would no longer be able to protect minority rights or the rule of law from the whims of the government of the day. It collapses the separation of powers.
And if that judicial check is removed, what's the ultimate danger to Israel's democracy?
The ultimate danger is what analysts call the one-state danger. It's the creation of a single, unequal state west of the Jordan River. If the government annexes more territory without giving equal civil rights to the millions of Palestinians living there, it fundamentally breaks with the democratic ideal of political equality.
Which would be explicitly anti-democratic.
Completely. And it would invite international isolation, massive civil unrest, and potentially even cause a wave of emigration from Jewish Israelis who don't want to live in an illiberal state. It's an existential threat to the state's formal democratic principles.
This really adds weight to that argument, that how a society views Israel is an indicator of its own will to survive, and that anti-Zionism is the acid test for this civilizational rot.
That framing sees a lot of modern anti-Zionism, especially among radical activist groups, as a symptom of the West's own self-loathing. This deconstructionist worldview traps people in what's called the zero-sum trap.
The idea that one side's freedom requires the other's elimination.
Exactly. The belief that existence itself is a form of oppression. So in this framework, Palestinian freedom requires the total erasure of Israel. When you hear a slogan like, "From the river to the sea," that's what it means. It's not a call for coexistence. And a Western society that tolerates or even champions that ideology against a democratic ally, well, that shows a profound failure of its own immune system.
And the argument goes deeper, that this isn't just about geopolitics, it's about the very foundations of the West.
There's a clear line drawn there. The core values of Western civilization, individual freedom, human dignity, the sanctity of life, they have deep historical roots in Judeo-Christian culture. So an existential attack on the Jewish state is seen as an attack on those roots.
And this was symbolized by the non-Israelis who were killed in the recent attacks.
Tragically, yes. The death of someone like Joshua Molel, a young agricultural student from Tanzania, on Israeli soil, it shows that the violence isn't just directed at Jews or Israelis, it's directed at the universal values that a place like Israel represents.
Now, this battle has a political front in the West, this strange coalition called the Red-Green-Brown Alliance. What is that?
It's a term used to describe a strategic alignment, often temporary, between radical left-wing groups, that's the red, Islamist movements, the green, and some far-right factions, the brown.
They don't seem like natural allies.
Their long-term goals are totally different, but they share an immediate enemy, the established liberal Western order, and they unite around the common goal of deconstructing it.
And we saw a political example of this with the election of Zohran Mamdani in New York. The analysis we're looking at calls him a Trojan horse.
The view is that his election represents this fusion of democratic socialist talking points with a less visible stealth Islamist political base. The Trojan horse idea suggests that under the surface of local issues like housing, there's a deeper ideological framework aimed at undermining the system itself.
And it taps into an older anti-colonial narrative.
Absolutely. It reframes every local struggle through the lens of colonization. So a landlord isn't just a landlord, he becomes the colonizer. A tenant becomes the colonized. This fusion of anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism gives this alliance a powerful, revolutionary rhetoric.
The analysis even makes a pretty startling historical comparison for this election.
It does. It compares Mamdani's win in New York to Salah ad-Din's victory at the Battle of Hattin in 1187. That battle led to the conquest of the Crusader kingdom in the Holy Land. The comparison suggests that this modern political victory in a major Western capital is a similar kind of turning point, a signal that the civilizational balance is shifting dramatically.
But this isn't just a problem on the left. The analysis also points to a very dangerous fracture on the American right.
And that's critical because it shows the decay is happening everywhere. The big example was the controversy at the Heritage Foundation over Tucker Carlson giving a platform to figures associated with the neo-Nazi movement.
Right, Nick Fuentes.
Yes. And the fallout from that revealed this simmering hostility to Christian Zionism and to Israel among parts of the populist right. When major Jewish organizations felt they had to resign from a leading conservative think tank in protest, it showed that the internal consensus on core Western values is dissolving across the entire political spectrum. The civilization can't even present a united front in theory anymore.
Okay, we've laid out a pretty bleak diagnosis of this entropic slide, structural, psychological, geopolitical. So now we have to ask, is there an alternative, a countermodel? If our modern institutions are failing, where can we look in history for a blueprint for success? And that brings us to the Medici.
Yes, moving from diagnosis to a potential prescription is vital. And the Medici family of Renaissance Florence, they offer an almost perfect historical case study in how to translate private wealth into real, durable political legitimacy and cultural influence.
We have to remember they were bankers first, innovators.
Exactly. Their fortune didn't just appear. It was built on real financial innovations, like double-entry bookkeeping. Which sounds dry, but it was revolutionary. It allowed them to manage a huge international banking network with incredible accuracy.
And the letter of credit.
The letter of credit was key. It let merchants move vast sums of money across Europe without physically carrying gold, which made international trade safer and faster. The Medici Bank became the central hub of the entire European economy. But their real genius was realizing that money alone wasn't enough to hold power, especially in a republic like Florence.
So their famous patronage of the arts wasn't just a hobby,
It was a political tool.
It was a core component of their political machinery. They pioneered what we'd now call strategic patronage. Sponsoring Michelangelo or Donatello wasn't just about making beautiful things. It was a calculated investment that paid off in massive political and social returns. By creating this whole ecosystem for the Renaissance to flourish, they were manufacturing the public consent they needed to rule.
Let's talk about that feedback loop. How did money become political capital?
It was a brilliant self-reinforcing cycle. The money from the bank was used with incredible precision. When Cosimo de' Medici paid for Brunelleschi's giant dome on the Florence Cathedral, he wasn't just building a roof, he was building the brand of Florence and, by extension, the brand of the Medici.
And a stronger brand meant more business.
Of course. A beautiful, prestigious city attracted more trade, more talent, more wealthy clients for the bank. Their reputation as pious patrons of Christian art also helped them land their most important client, the papacy. They became the Pope's bankers, and that brought in enormous profits and prestige. So economic power funded culture, which created social capital and trust, which in turn solidified and grew their economic power.
Let's focus on Cosimo de' Medici. He basically ruled Florence without ever being a prince. How did he use culture to legitimize his power?
Cosimo knew that in a republic you needed public goodwill, so he meticulously funded public works like the library at the convent of San Marco, and he made sure it was open to all scholars. This earned him the title Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland, after his death.
So that goodwill was like a political insurance policy.
It was. There is a famous story where his political rivals managed to get him exiled, but the city's economy tanked without him, and the public outcry was so great that the government was forced to invite him back in triumph. He ruled not by force, but by making himself indispensable to the city's culture and economy.
And the art they commissioned was never just decorative, it was full of political messaging.
Always. You look at the Guzzoli frescoes in the Medici Palace Chapel. It's supposed to be the journey of the Magi, but he painted portraits of the Medici family and their allies right into the sacred scene. The message is clear. The Medici are guiding Florence with divine approval.
And Donatello's David.
Right. The David was the ultimate symbol of the Florentine Republic's victory over its enemies. But Cosimo placed it in his own private palace courtyard. The subtext was powerful. The city's freedom and success are directly tied to the strength and wisdom of the Medici family.
Then his grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, took it to another level.
Lorenzo was less of a banker and more of a showman, a master of public relations. He organized these huge, lavish public festivals and carnivals. He positioned himself as the guarantor of the city's happiness. And this public affection saved his life during the Pazzi conspiracy when his rivals tried to assassinate him. The people of Florence saw an attack on Lorenzo as an attack on the city itself.
But their real, lasting genius was creating an entire ecosystem for talent.
Yes, it wasn't just about one-off commissions. Cosimo founded the Platonic Academy. He didn't just give it a grant. He gave the scholar Marsilio Ficino a house and a lifelong salary to translate all of Plato's works into Latin for the first time. He was building the intellectual infrastructure for the entire humanist movement. And of course, the scholars he supported produced work that legitimized Medici rule.
And Lorenzo took that a step further with his personal involvement, like with Michelangelo.
It shows that their own judgment was what mattered, not some committee. Lorenzo saw the talent in a teenage Michelangelo and didn't just give him a commission. He invited him to live in his house, eat at his table with his own sons, and study the family's collection of ancient sculpture. That's direct, high-leverage sponsorship. It showed they were willing to bet on raw, unproven talent.
Okay, let's bring this back to today. We have these massive centers of private wealth, Silicon Valley, Wall Street. What can they learn from the Medici blueprint, especially when so much modern wealth feels disconnected from any civic duty?
That is the central challenge. How do you turn that atomized private wealth into a durable public good? The Medici method gives us, I think, 4 clear principles for any modern leader who wants to build a lasting legacy.
Okay, what's the first one? Direct sponsorship.
This means moving beyond just writing checks to big institutions. It means making targeted bets on specific, talented individuals. Instead of giving $1 million to a museum's general fund, a patron could create a fellowship for 5 brilliant young historians, giving them a 5-year, no-strings-attached stipend to do their work. It shows you trust individual genius, not just bureaucracy.
Second principle, institution building. Creating something that will outlive you.
Exactly. The Medici built libraries. The modern equivalent might be a new, independent research institute dedicated to preserving knowledge in the digital age, or maybe an atelier that combines new technology with traditional craftsmanship to ensure those skills don't die out. The goal is to use private money to create a tangible, long-lasting public good.
Number 3 is networking and convening.
This was the Medici's secret weapon. They created the salon, a space for different minds to meet and cross-pollinate. Today's patrons need to do the same. Host private, curated conferences that bring together people who would never normally meet. Technologists, artists, military strategists, philosophers. The patron's greatest asset isn't just money, it's their network. Forcing those collisions between different fields is how you generate truly new ideas.
And the final principle, philosophical patronage.
This means funding work that reflects a coherent vision for society, something that goes beyond just making a profit. If today's tech billionaires are criticized for being disconnected, this is the remedy. Fund a major public art project that embodies a civic virtue. Underwrite a long-form journalism project dedicated to exploring deep historical questions. It creates a synergy between your economic success and the cultural health of society. It anchors your legacy in something that matters.
We started this deep dive with that diagnosis of civilizational erasure and the idea that the borders of the West have moved from the map into the mind. It seems clear now that the most powerful agent of that erasure is an internal one, this cultural self-loathing that convinces a civilization it isn't worth defending.
I think we have to face this moment with what some have called Spenglerian sobriety. Oswald Spengler saw civilizations as organisms with life cycles, and his framework sort of forces us to recognize, without false optimism, that we might be in the early winter of the West. But that recognition isn't a reason for despair. It's the necessary starting point for any meaningful action.
So what is that core action for the individual who sees this happening?
It has to be the unwavering reconstruction of objective reality. In an age where truth is subjective and basic facts are denied by our institutions, the most rebellious act is a commitment to free inquiry. It's defending the idea of genuine meritocracy. It's defending free speech as the absolute non-negotiable requirement for finding any kind of truth.
So the duty isn't to pretend that spring is coming, but to tend the flame through the winter.
The duty of the watchman is to keep vigil. You tend the embers of order, the flame of reason, of historical memory, of the will to endure. You keep it alive so that when the storm of erasure finally passes, the fire can be lit again. The watch continues.